Hello, everyone, and welcome to a production of the Barry Flinchbaugh Center for Ag and Food Policy. And we are happy to have you listening with us today for what is a special conversation, we hope. It is actually an offshoot of a growingly popular podcast in and of itself called Smoke and Mirrors, Ag Policy Unfiltered, out of Kansas State University. And we have the host of that podcast with us today. You'll be hearing from her in just a moment. This, again, is an offshoot called Clearing the Air on Agricultural Policy, where we'll play off of some of the items that are discussed during the aforementioned podcast and get into them in a deeper dive, if you will, with our guests, whom we'll introduce in just a moment. First, just a bit about the Barry Flinchbaugh Center for Ag and Food Policy. If you're not familiar with it, it's a national leader in policy analysis and education, and it aims to achieve a number of things, including improving understanding of policy alternatives and consequences to enable informed decisions by policymakers, by agricultural leaders, by food system stakeholders, and of course by the public at large, and to ensure that agricultural policies and strategies are based on facts and on rational consideration. All of those principles were near and dear to Dr. Barry Flinchbaugh, and so we harp on those with the work of the center. The activities of the center, for your information, include policy education. They include identifying emerging policy challenges through surveys and the convening panels of diverse experts, such as this one today, to frame issues and to explore solutions. The center hosts policy conferences, produces comprehensive policy reports, and updates economic indicators on a quarterly basis. To learn more about the center, and we encourage you would do so, go to flinchbaughcenter.com. That's flinchbaughcenter.com. As to our Clearing the Air podcast today, though, we'd like to introduce to you now the participants. Jennifer Ifft is an associate professor and extension specialist, and Jennifer is the Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair at Kansas State University. Jenny's the host of that weekly podcast, Smoke and Mirrors, Ag Policy Unfiltered. You'll hear from her in just a second. Joining us later on then, Brad Lubben, Associate Extension Professor and Agriculture and Public Policy Specialist at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and Mark Edelman, Professor Emeritus and longtime Agriculture and Rural Policy Specialist at Iowa State University. Mark, a close associate of Dr. Flinchbaugh for some 4 decades. As for our featured guest today, and we're delighted to have him joining us for this conversation, he's a familiar name in agricultural policy circles, Joe Glauber. Joe is with the International Food Policy Research Institute, a research fellow emeritus in the Director General's office. His areas of interest are price volatility, global grain reserves, crop insurance, and trade. Prior to joining that institute, though, Joe spent over 30 years with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, including the chief economist of the USDA from 2008 to 2014. He was responsible for the department's agricultural forecasts and projections. He oversaw climate, energy, regulatory issues, and he served as the chairman of the board of directors for the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. Joe, a very familiar name in agricultural circles. We're pleased to have him comment today, and we'll turn it over to Jenny now so she can get the conversation going with Joe. Jenny?
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Eric. And Joe, thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about broadly the intersection of economics and politics. And maybe you might be one of the best people to talk about how that collided in your role as chief economist. But before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about your career at USDA before you became the chief economist?
Yeah, sure. No, thanks. And thanks so much for the invitation to be on this podcast. I went to USDA right out of grad school, went to the Economic Research Service where I worked for, I guess, almost 5 years at the Economic Research Service, doing work on a lot of market analysis. My program area was essentially oilseeds and fibers, so I did a lot of work on soybeans and cotton. But in 91, I got invited to be at the President's Council of Economic Advisors at the White House and in charge of agriculture and trade issues there. And so that was during the first Bush administration. And I was there for a year, and then was invited, I was planning to go back to the Economic Research Service, but I got a call from the Assistant Secretary for Economics at the time. This was back in the days when the chief economist at USDA was a political appointment. I got invited to be his deputy, and so I came over not as a political appointee, but as a career appointee, or in a career position. And then almost immediately, the election happened. And Keith Collins, someone I had worked with at Economic Research Service, was made acting assistant secretary, and I was the acting deputy. And then we were both converted. That office was converted to what became the chief economist's office. And so I worked for Keith for 15 years. At the tail end of that, I was at the U.S. Trade Rep's office for 2 years in charge of agricultural negotiations. So I was in Geneva for 2 years working on the so-called Doha round at the time. And that was really a rewarding experience. However, halfway through it, Keith retired, and I was asked to come back and be chief economist. The problem was the U.S. trade representative at the time, Sue Schwab, said, well, you can't leave. You're in charge of these negotiations. For a couple of years, for a year at least, I had 2 jobs and 2 cell phones and 1 salary, which makes you wonder what kind of a negotiator I really was. But it was quite an experience, and I really look at that in one sense as the high point of my career at USDA. But after that, I came back and then was, my introduction says, I was chief economist for about 7 years, and then I went on. I retired from federal government, went to the International Food Policy Research Institute. And I've been working there pretty much for the last 11 years. I have affiliations with other think tanks here in town, the Center for Strategic International Studies and American Enterprise Institute. But yeah, so long career, a lot of time.
Absolutely. That's great. That's great. If we could go back now to when you were the, I guess, chief economist, and before, it's what, maybe 2 decades in the office of the chief economist?
Yeah, 22 years. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So can you explain what that office does, and then what your role was?
Yeah, I mean, you got a little bit of it in the introduction. I mean, over what happened in the early 90s when I was in that office is that, as I say, it was no longer a political office. We had a chief economist, and that office was reorganized to oversee the World Agricultural Outlook Board, which of course coordinates all the supply and demand estimates across the department. We had a small risk assessment group in there that oversaw all of the regulatory operations at the department and had to clear off on any of the regulations that had economically significant impacts. We have a climate office in that, and then an energy office also was in that group. It's grown since I left, I might add, but those were the main things when I was there. Yet, for all the day-to-day work we did with those offices, the biggest role was advising the secretary and the subcabinet on economic issues. So, like most things, you'd come in the morning and get a call, and that was from the secretary's office on something, and that's what you worked on for that day. But, you tried your best to keep on top of everything else that was going on.
So I actually first met you when I was at the Economic Research Service. And I remember I had a friend who moved over to the chief economist's office, and he's like, I remember him telling me, we actually get to have an opinion here. Because at ERS, it was sort of pounded into our heads, everything you do has to be fact-based, it has to be based on research. You don't add on, you don't make policy recommendations. And so I thought, oh, that was, kind of interesting. I don't know if it was necessarily having an opinion, but, you really were, having to provide advice and sort of being a bridge between the sort of economic analysis and political realities that the secretary
absolutely.
faces.
Absolutely. And I don't want to make it, I do want to at least say that our opinions are also fact-based. It's not like we gave up any of that. I mean, we I think our role, though, and it's funny because I think any sort of role we had with the public, it was always sort of explaining, here, the administration's going to do this. Here's what we think might happen. I testified probably on an average of 5 to 10 times a year up on the Hill, to where they would bring my predecessor and I in for hearings and ask questions, and they expected from us objective answers. So, I remember any number of times of being, I won't say in hot water, but speaking my mind on, or, saying what research at ERS and other places in academia said about, say, regulations on livestock marketing. And they were oftentimes at odds with, what at least some of the politicals at USDA might be saying at the time. And that was okay. I never got taken to the woodshed for that. I think Dan Glickman was secretary. And I remember going in and going up to his office and saying, here's what the economics would be. And he was very clear. He says, okay, I understand that. I got to think about a lot of other factors, including political ones, but I understand what you're trying to tell me. And I always felt like, okay, that's what we want. There's a famous economist, and now dead, George Stigler, was at the University of Chicago, and he was Nobel Prize winner. And he used to talk about regulatory economists. And he said one of the roles of regulatory economists was to pour cold water on bad ideas. And I think that we took that to heart and really spent a lot of time pushing back if we thought a particular proposal was a bad one. And, again, my feeling was if they listened to us and understood what we were trying to say, that was fine. My job was essentially done, that I wasn't there to advocate for a position. It was more to really explain what the consequences of their position might be.
And do you have any more sort of specific examples of, a topic where you felt like there was a real difference between what maybe the economic analysis showed and what the sort of political realities were?
Yeah. Well, I remember a very funny hearing. Well, it was probably less funny at the time for me, but I was called up to testify on something called the GIPSA rule. And this was a rule that was going forward back in, I guess, 2000s, late 2000s, or early 2000 teens, I guess, looking at that would regulate marketing contracts and other things. And my office was very concerned because we had just had a big study that we had commissioned, that USDA had commissioned 3 or 4 years ago. Before that had shown all the benefits of these marketing contracts, and yet they were there was a few people there who were suggesting some draconian changes to the regulations at the time. And I was asked to testify before the Hill. And that was very delicate. I mean, we had put forward a proposed regulation at the time. And I remember sitting at the witness stand or witness table and having a senator come over to me, and I won't say who, and he just whispered in my ear. He says, Glauber, I like you a lot. He says, but I'm going to beat you up today. He says, we don't like this regulation. I said, that's fine. I'd be disappointed if you weren't doing your job. But I got in a very heated, we were mainly talking about the economics, and I got in a very heated discussion at one point. And I just said, look, what I can tell you is this is economically significant, this rule. This is no question about it. And that was, I think that took a lot. Everyone said, okay, well, you recognize that. That's great. So that was one. There were a lot of other type of hearings. Trade could be very dicey if there was a lot of tension on that. And some of the hearings that we had to do, I think I'm thinking probably more when I was a trade negotiator. I was going up to the Hill almost when I was in town. I would go up every time. I spent a lot of time overseas during that period, but whenever I was in town, I would go up and give briefings to the committee and committee staff, and those were always pretty heated. But you wanted just to lay out sort of, here are the options, and here's what we're thinking, and they would let you know what they were thinking.
Do you wish they had Zoom when you were in Doha?
Yeah, I tell you, that was, the 2007, I think I was gone for 6 months out of the year. 2008, 7 months. That's a long time. And that wasn't staying in Geneva for 7 months. It was traveling back and forth and other places. And it sounds more exotic than it is. Frankly, it gets pretty old, and it gets old because you do have families and things like that. So, but it was important, and I think that I don't know when I was asked to be the trade negotiator, I talked to the trade rep at the time, and I said, "Look, here's the one thing I want is I want to be able to make decisions at the time. We have to make decisions. I don't want to have to say, I'll get back to you after I talk to people in Washington." I said, you got to trust me on this because it's not going to work if we have to wait back and forth. Now, that would have been easier if there had been Zoom, but the time zone differences and other things, and the fact we were negotiating all, at all hours during the day during those periods, and Sue Schwab, who was the trade rep at the time, said, "Fine, I trust you. That's why I have you here. Don't mess up." So I remember that, and I don't think I messed up, so that was good.
Yeah. What would you say are the best and worst parts of being the chief economist?
The best part is you really do have, you are thrown in a lot of interesting meetings, a lot of, you are able to use economics in a way that probably pushes it a bit more. The bad news is you don't have necessarily the time you'd like to think about, with some issues. You have to kind of come up with quick and dirty analyses. And again, I always felt pretty comfortable. I think, the best part of the job is one of the things I liked the best about the chief economist's office was all the market stuff. I mean, I really enjoyed lockups. I really enjoyed getting in there. As chief economist, on the other hand, we tried to keep a little bit of space between what we did and what the World Board did, in the sense of we didn't want, even though we weren't political, because of the fact we reported to the Secretary's office, we didn't want to make it, we want to be sure that it didn't look like we were trying to influence what the board was doing or anything like that. So, but those were really good years. Also, just being surrounded by a very highly talented staff. I mean, we had a very good. I think that continues to be the case at USDA. There was job satisfaction was very high in our office. I think people liked working there. They felt like they were contributing to decisions being made and other things. So that was all really good. Yeah, the bad news is that you're on call all the time, and that didn't bother me. You just try to manage personal time and work time and things like that. And a new administration comes in, and you're there with the furniture, really. And so everyone, a new administration comes in, they want to hit the road running, they want to work long hours and everything, and you're kind of there with them, and then they go after 4 years are gone or 8 years are gone, and you're there for the next group. And so it's a little tough. But again, that's part of I think what we tried to do is stick with, as long as we were objective and not looking like we were, trying to shade the facts for a particular administration, we survived a lot of administration changes. I mean, I worked 30 years at Department of Agriculture, 15 years under Republicans and 15 years under Democrats. And I think that that office was well respected on the Hill for, being objective.
Right. So to sort of wrap this up and switch gears to our panel discussion, my podcast, Smoke and Mirrors, is about making sense of agricultural policy. And I have a wide range of listeners. It could be producers, loan officers, graduate students, folks like you all. And you've kind of already answered this, but this sort of basic question: why should people care about what the Office of the Chief Economist does? That you have a group of career government economists that are working closely with the different administrations. Why do you think that work is important?
Yeah, I think you want your political leaders to have the best information possible. I mean, I think that's it. Again, they're not always going to follow any advice you might have, but I think that, and I have to say, there were, without getting into names, we had administrations where a new secretary would come in and think that they can do everything, just be surrounded by their small handful of advisors. And I think pretty soon they realized that there are things they just need to know. And they need to have people there that have some history about what policies have been done in the past. And I think we were a pretty good repository for that. But I think, again, it seemed the case that almost everyone all these secretaries realized they needed a general counsel there in those decisions, and they needed the chief economist around the table. Again, not always listening to us, but we're interested in what we had to say.
And I think what we want to do here is go ahead, since we are so fortunate to have you, Joe, to start with anyway, get your 30,000-foot view of present day in as far as our agricultural trade status, and then relating back to the general ag economy. Now, that's a huge area to cover, but just some things that jump out at you initially that are going on that bear close watching in your view.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a very unusual time. I mean, certainly compared to anything I've seen in 40 years. Just on the one hand, the trade wars the trade wars at a time when the global agricultural economy is, we've seen this decline in prices following, the big run up we saw coming out of COVID and with the war in Ukraine. We had record high nominal prices at the time, and then they've been declining. And, the world is very competitive. It's gotten more and more competitive. The U.S. is one of a lot of major producers. The good news is we don't have to be the lowest cost to sell product, but we have to be one of the lowest costs, and we can't. That's where when you see things like tariffs hitting, it hurts our competitiveness. And even now with with this kind of truce in the trade war with China, we are still struggling with an additional 10% tariff on soybeans that essentially makes us less competitive with Brazil and other oilseed suppliers. And for someone who spent a lot of my career working on things like NAFTA negotiations, Uruguay round negotiations, I'm very much involved with them at the time, and then Doha negotiations, and then TPP, all those things. To sort of see them viewed as not even less valuable. I mean, really actively changing in the sense of now going back and trying to raise tariffs on a lot of goods and things. I think that's very unfortunate. And I think it's short. I hope that, this is just a short interval where we get back on a path towards a more open trading environment. Because I think, U.S. agriculture has really benefited from that. And I think that to turn your back on world markets and expect, compensation's nice. And I think it's understandable given the price effects we've seen, but it's hard to think that that's sustainable over the long run. And so that's, again, my biggest concern right now is just what I see there.
Could you describe for sort of the average listener out there just how the World Trade Organization, how big is it, and who all's involved? It's really a rules trading policy that all countries that are signees participate on sort of what was envisioned as a level playing field. And how far out of kilter are we from a level playing field, and where are we headed in sort of the current structure, lack of structure?
I know it's a great question, Mark. And of course, the WTO was predated by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which came out of the post-World War II, where countries agreed to try to liberalize their economies by reducing tariffs. And we saw successive rounds of negotiations over that period from the late 40s all the way up through the 80s, where tariffs were brought down for mostly industrial goods, not agriculture. Agriculture was pretty much left out of those negotiations. And at the time in the mid-80s, we were having a massive trade war with European Union subsidizing exports. We were subsidizing exports. We had high supports here in this country. And then we started seeing these reforms that both domestically with moving away from set-asides, moving away from high loan rates, moving more towards direct income support. And Europe did the same, which resulted helped pave the way for this agreement for the World Trade Organization, creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. It went into effect, and we've had that set of trade rules. Now, what the WTO says is, if you're a signatory and you've agreed to the rules that operating here, if you get out of kilter with the rules, there's no such thing as the WTO police. It's not like anyone comes and says, okay, now you're in violation. But countries can say, hey, you're not abiding by the rules, and we're going to take a case against you in the WTO. There is a panel then composed that looks at those, the pros and cons and the arguments, and then rules. But even then, it doesn't force you to change your behavior. What it does say is saying, okay, if you want to continue doing what you're doing, that's fine, but you have to pay compensation, and it is normally in the form of giving compensation in terms of improved market access. That system actually has worked very well. The dispute settlement process, the U.S. took, I think in the case of agriculture, we took several cases against countries, and the panels agreed with us like 90% of the time. I mean, in terms of the individual claims that we made in these cases, panels overwhelmingly supported the U.S. position. So agriculture is really, I would argue, has benefited immensely from that system. Yes, it's true that countries have taken cases against us as well, and we lost a few of those, but generally, I always point to the fact that in 2018, at a time when we were, I guess the first trade war with China started, we won two large cases in the WTO. One on TRQ administration that China was using to exclude product coming into where they weren't operating their import quotas according to WTO rules. They complied with that ruling, and our imports at that point began to increase again. And we took a case against them about the level of support they were providing those producers, and that they also complied with those in the sense they brought down their support prices. Other things that we were seeing at the time in terms of higher stock levels and other things, those all began to come down immensely. So I think in one sense that system's worked pretty well. It also has a broad commission to look at SPS, or a committee to look at SPS issues that have been very successful, that works very, very well. There's a review committee as well that looks at agricultural policies for each country, which tries to resolve disputes before they even begin. And that actually has worked pretty well. What the WTO has not done is really made further progress in terms of reductions of tariffs and other things. But I think that really from about the mid-2000s onward, there just has been less effort there. And that's not just the U.S., but it's countries like India and others have just not been as cooperative in terms of trying to reach agreements. But it still performs a very valuable function as a clearinghouse for things like SPS measures and even trade disputes. There's still that dispute settlement process continues.
Joe, I might ask that question and go further, maybe more concerned. You still talk about the successes of the WTO, but you're right, the negotiations on further agreements haven't made fundamental progress in 20 years. The dispute settlement process itself is somewhat broken at the moment with the concerns about judges and appellate judges and so forth. So the reporting and the analysis and the collaboration still works, but fundamentally, is there a future for the broad-based WTO with 160 plus countries trying to come to consensus on something? Or is the future really driven by more regional agreements and bilateral discussions with the partners we already trade with?
No, Brad, you're raising an excellent point, and I think that is true. I think, again, since the mid-2000s or so, with the there was a big effort made in the so-called Doha round that ended in 2007, 2008, I guess, with countries just walking away at that point saying they couldn't get an agreement because there was such differences on certain key elements. Since then, I think, the rest of the world has gone ahead and tried to develop a lot of free trade agreements. I mean, we've seen just this last week, I guess, the EU finally concluded a deal with Mercosur countries in South America. India just concluded a deal with New Zealand. There's a lot of bilateral work going on. Unfortunately, the U.S. has not been part of that. It really has not been part of that. I guess the last major effort was TPP that, U.S. was a key architect in. And then we pulled out in 2017. President Trump, I think it was one of the first things he did when he came into office. And unfortunately, I think, in my view, that was quite unfortunate for U.S. agriculture. We saw TPP as providing a lot of benefits. And, of course, it didn't stop the other countries from concluding that agreement. And so the U.S. has been at a loss or has not had the preference in certain markets that other suppliers like Canada or Australia have had. And I think that, again, the world is continuing to make these agreements, and these are very complicated agreements. I mean, I think you want an agreement that has detailed provisions on what happens if you're not following that agreement, how do you resolve disputes, other things. What we've seen over the last year are a lot of trade frameworks that have been sort of established. I think it's less clear to me how long they last. Right now, we haven't really seen how they're going to work. There's been a lot of press releases on things out of the White House, but I look at them and think there needs to be more meat there. As a trade negotiator, when we were negotiating hundreds of pages of documents on various provisions, just to make sure that there's compliance with those provisions, I think that's a real concern to me.
I'd kind of follow up with that a little bit. I'm interested as we look forward to where we're headed. To what extent can we revise our national security policy, as the president has, where we become more focused on the North and South America? How much will that affect our trade flows? I mean, does our trade flows have to follow our national security policy, or can they be rather independent? Because we trade with the whole world, not just what happens in our part of the globe. I mean, we can either figure out what's in the mutual interests of our trading partners and ourselves, or if we try to use a big stick and really don't have a big stick in the process, where do we head? How do we rationalize everything?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's no question Canada and Mexico are, they're two of our top markets, or two of the three top markets for U.S. agricultural exports, and they're the large, certainly two of the top markets for imports into the U.S. So I expect, because of the agreements that we've had through NAFTA and the successor USMCA, those are really important markets. And we've seen how important those markets are when we have problems with markets like China, right, where all of a sudden, Mexico has loomed even more important for exports of corn and soybeans and wheat and other products. But China too it continues to be the world's largest importer of agricultural goods. It's a very important market for us to be part of that. Brazil has increased its export share into China, but the U.S. still, particularly from harvest time, if you're talking September to, say, January or February, we are the major supplier of soybeans in the world. And so we need to be able to sell those beans everywhere. And China is is the world's largest buyer right now, continues to import. 60% of the world's imports are in China. So a very, very important market. And if you look at the emerging markets elsewhere, most of them are Asian markets. I mean, that's where people really see, at least for the time being. People talk about, places like Nigeria and other places in sub-Saharan Africa perhaps become bigger markets. Right now, they aren't. And the big markets the growing markets continue to be those countries that are seeing continued population growth and continued income growth. And that's a lot of the markets in like Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam. These are all very important markets for the U.S. And I hate the idea that we might be shut out of those because of preferential trade agreements with other suppliers. And that, to me, is, again, I'd rather see a more well-structured trade agreement with these countries that improves market access and addresses a whole number of concerns, rather than these sort of what looked to me like long-term grain agreements. You might remember those when we would have those with the former Soviet Union or China. They never lasted very long. They would almost, by the time the ink dried on the agreement, they had gotten away from the purchase requirements. I mean, you think a little bit about phase one. We saw there too a big increase for a year or two, and then those imports have come down. And I think that's where, at least when you're talking about provisions, where you get commitments to reduce tariffs and other things, you get the commercials involved and with private buyers, and that's what's really important. I think they will drive the trade because they will see U.S. as competitive in those markets.
Well, Joe, how all of this resonates at the farm gate, if you would. It obviously is an important subject when it comes to the profitability of farming today. Where is it? What does your crystal ball say? What's this going to look like for the farmer out there in the next 2 to 3 years as we have this trade and tariff free-for-all, it seems, in some respects?
Yeah, it is just so hard to the better case scenario, obviously, is that these trade agreements amount to something, that we do see increased trade in some of these countries where we've struck these bargains, that we don't see further deterioration in terms of counter retaliation. I think that hopefully we'll see a more normalized relationship with China. I think that would all bring back, in terms of volume, the volume levels that we're exporting are pretty similar to the past years. So it's really been a price issue in terms of the export market. And we are in one sense in just a downturn in the global ag economy. I mean, it's not just the U.S. Other countries are also suffering from low prices. That won't last forever. We will see prices return, I think, at some point. Whether or not that doesn't look like it's this year, unless we see some unforeseen drought somewhere right now. But it wouldn't take much to turn prices around, I think, in terms of a weather disturbance. I mean, global stocks are still relatively tight. They've built up, but it doesn't take much to have some poor harvest in a major wheat producing country could really turn prices around very quickly, I think.
Joe, if I could beg your perspective there too, you're talking like global markets and export opportunities still fundamentally matter and help drive the demand equation for U.S. ag. Do you expect that to rebound and be the case, or are we on the cusp of sort of ignoring global competition and focusing on domestic utilization with biofuels and other options?
Boy, I certainly hope it's the case, Brad. I mean, I think that as much as domestic demand, I mean, I think that clearly has been, no question, the ethanol boom that we saw in the late 2000s, has really contributed to that. The fact that we're seeing corn prices now, probably 50% higher than they would have been otherwise. I mean, that's just a huge chunk of the ethanol grind is such a big component of the corn crop. If you think you can push blend rates to higher levels nationally, that's one issue. If you think you can, through subsidies and other things or mandates, push sustainable aviation fuel, I mean, those are all big potentials for that market. Similar with biodiesel, we've seen this big increase. But at the end of the day, you still have limits in terms of overall fuel economies, other things, those markets. I think trade is just such an enormous, it's something you can't turn your back on. And what I don't think is sustainable is, Congress providing, or the administration providing big supplemental bills year after year. I mean, this has just been incredible over the last 5 or 6 years. If you look at the average amount that's coming in addition to the underlying price and income support safety net, it's just, I mean, maybe this can continue, but I don't think it's really something that is good overall for the agriculture. I mean, I think to the degree you can make these profits by selling your product overseas and other things, that's much, much better for the long run sustainability.
I'd like to follow up on that. You referred to the supplemental or ad hoc payments. I think we're in an ad hoc era of foreign policy right now. And I'm curious, if we look back, I'd say the first 6 decades of foreign policy, you had a system of price support, supply management. Where the government, we had the set-aside policy, storing grain. And I think at the very beginning, people knew that maybe wasn't sustainable, but it took 6 decades to really unravel it. And I'm curious if you could see any parallels with our current ad hoc era, perhaps in terms of cost. Is what we're doing now actually more cost? And I know, like, I emailed you about this, I think like 4 years ago, is it getting to be more costly than storage? And I know that's that system we had. Are there also sustainability concerns? Is this just going to keep going?
Well, you're the young one here. The rest of us remember certainly the 80s when you had successive farm bills and budget actions that were trying to wring out as much as possible from the budget, not just the ag budget, but the budget overall. I'm thinking of Barry Flinchbaugh now, but if you think about coming into the 80s, we had a farm bill that was really hemorrhaging money by the early 80s, and Congress stepped in and said, "Okay, wait a minute, we're going to control budget a little bit by putting in set-asides." And the next thing you know, you had this over-regulated market where classic, and you guys probably remember this, but in 1988, when we had a drought in the Midwest and we had soybean prices, I think a soybean to corn ratio of almost 3.5, 4, we couldn't get anyone to shift into soybeans. And why? Because if they did it, they lost their corn base. Just was a terrible regulated system. And I think that, a lot of people argued to Congress, a lot of ag economists like Barry and others said, hey, try to get, let markets drive these producer acreage decisions, and you'll be in, the markets will do a much, much better job of allocating resources, and you don't need the government to be telling farmers what to plant. And I think that was a real positive development out of all of that. And frankly, we did pretty well over several years. COVID sort of changed. I think the trade war was the first kind of big thing, and all of a sudden, the China market, which had been so dominant, they were our number one trading partner. When that was hit in 2018 and 2019, again, you came in with a lot of money, provided compensation. It wasn't perfect. I think given the time frame, USDA did as good a job as possible of trying to match losses, but no one was happy with it. And unfortunately, the longer run losses were even worse, that weren't even compensated. So you saw Brazil all of a sudden plant, I think over the 3 years following 2018, they planted like 15 million acres of soybeans. I mean, it's just all of a sudden a huge market share increase, and in global markets, let alone in China. And then you had COVID and all the monies that went out there. And I think all these authorities like the Commodity Credit Corporation Charter Act, where no one thought about using, or, it was used a little bit with, here's a 10 million, we could provide farmers for this. All of a sudden, you replace those millions with billions. And, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that assistance shouldn't have been provided, but I think it got too easy in one sense to kind of do that. That I think in the old, in the 80s, 90s, even 2000s, if there was a disaster in Congress, weighed and said, okay, we're going to have a supplemental bill here, ad hoc disaster bill. We know what it costs. Here's what it is. We're going to provide that money. That was a much more deliberate process. I think all this ad hoc stuff, the using CCC Charter Act, has really kind of undermined a lot of that discipline, and I don't think it's helped agriculture, frankly.
Do we need to go back and I recall learning words like decoupling and freedom to farm, and there was a part of that process. And you mentioned the 23 Ag Policy Commission and the 96 Farm Bill. Do we need to? Is there a need for re-looking at where we go the next 25 years, as was done back then? Or maybe you'd like to explain a little bit about how that commission worked.
Yeah, Mark,
because you were there.
You're raising a great question, or a great issue. I mean, 96, the Freedom to Farm came out. I think a lot of people were like, okay, well, how's this going to work? And Pat Roberts at the time, who was the big proponent in the House, certainly with that bill, he knew that there was a lot of uncertainty with it, and he at the time said, well, let's set up a commission and get a bunch of bright people sitting around a table, and let's let them think about what agriculture should look like in the 21st century. And so this commission was established. It was a bipartisan commission. The Dems and the Republicans agreed on who was going to be on it, and it was chaired by Barry Flinchbaugh, and they put out a report. It was run out of the chief economist's office, so I was involved with it a lot and sat in on all the meetings. And it was a real open. What was striking about that is everyone went back to sort of basics, like, okay, well, let's think about, forget about 50, 60 years in the past. What does agriculture need today? And I think that, like a lot of commission reports, it probably went on the shelf and everyone forgot about it. But I think that is something I wish that Congress would do more of. I wish they would do more, have hearings, where you bring in diverse voices saying, here's what's right about agricultural policy, here's what's wrong about agricultural policy. To me, and again, I'm an outsider. I know I look at this from the same vantage point you guys do. You just kind of follow the news or follow the news clips or whatever. But it seems to me that the last several years, Congress really hasn't done much of that. What they do is they tend to say, okay, well, we're going to have a farm bill, and a lot of it gets done in committees, and they tend to be kind of, here's what we did in the past. Let's just continue to do that, or bump up this or bump up that. I think that it would be good to have sort of in my view, a real complete. Let's go back to basics. Let's look at everything. What do we want agriculture to look like, and what's the best way of getting there?
That's a good place we might want to wrap things up. But Joe, just would like to part with your general thoughts on the state of agriculture. We've said a lot of things here that would indicate some hurdles to climb, so forth. How do you feel about the next 5 years agriculturally, from the trade, from the domestic economy perspective? Just some general thoughts.
I think generally, if we can get back to markets, the U.S. agriculture will do just fine. I think we're still one of the low-cost producers in the world. We're very competitive in most of the products that we produce and sell in the world, and that alone will ensure that we'll be in good shape over the next 5-10 years. I think where we get hurt is when agriculture becomes collateral damage for other, because of other actions taken. And I think trade wars and other things that, if this were another program, I might argue their effectiveness in general anyway. But I think insofar as agriculture is concerned, this is not like we have we have a lot of trade disputes with countries in agriculture, but they can be addressed with bilateral trade negotiations. We don't need to have the, threats on tariffs and other things, because as we see, so we're back on track with soybeans. We're going to purchase, China's committed to buying 12 million tons this year, 25 after that. Well, we lost a year. We lost a half a year in any event. And so if you look at the soybean exports for this current marketing year, we're going to be at half the level that we were the year before. That's a loss. That's a big loss. And yes, you can compensate this year, but can you compensate next year? Those are big questions with me. So I think that to the degree we can keep those sorts of actions from affecting agriculture and just let farmers follow market signals and plant, and they'll do fine.
Joe, your insight's been immensely appreciated. Thank you for taking the time to join us on this podcast, and we look forward to hearing more from you down the road. Appreciate it.
All right, great. Thanks.
Joe Glauber has been our special guest, International Food Policy Research Institute, and we thank him. We also thank our panel, Mark Edelman, Iowa State University, Brad Lubben, University of Nebraska, and Jenny Ifft of Kansas State University. This has been the Clearing the Air podcast out of the Barry Flinchbaugh Center for Ag and Food Policy, and we would also note that we should thank our producer, Dana Woodbury of the Center, for putting this all together. We hope to have another such podcast in a few weeks, so be tuning in for that. Until next time, Eric Atkinson from Kansas State University. Thanks for joining us.